So we are in part 3 of a 4-part sermon series called The Bigger Picture. And in week 1, we talked about the first half of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 12, where he talked fairly extensively about how people have different gifts. And there were people in Corinth who were battling over what the most important gifts were. And Paul's point was, look, everybody has different gifts, and that's fine. And they're all equal, and they're all good, because each of them are given and provided by God, and they are equally good, just as each of you are equally good, just because you were born of God, and your value comes from the roots of that gift of being a child of God, and nobody can take that away from you. That all of these gifts are given to you, and all are good, but they are meant to be used not for just yourself, but that they are meant to be used for the common good. And that kind of like Legos, they're not all that particularly interesting in and of themselves, just laying on the floor. As a matter of fact, if they lay on the floor and you step on one, they hurt. But if you put them together, if you can connect them, bigger things happen. When you take these things and put the skills together and you put the gifts together and you do that, something greater and beautiful can take place. And we also represented that. You may see if you weren't here in the first 2 weeks, then if you see the picture there or there of the church that's made up, if you look closely, made up of thousands of pictures of all of you from pictures from the year in review, representing that the church isn't this building. As a matter of fact, this place could burn to the ground and this church would be successful, might even thrive even greater, as much as I love this place. And no, I'm not planning to burn it down for progressing as a community of faith. But if this building went away, we would probably improve as a community of faith. Each of our gifts coming together as people working together is the church. Working for the common good is what makes things better. And the challenge to all of you was to identify a gift. To identify a gift that you can bring to bear within this community of faith. To say, how can we take those gifts that are being brought here for the common good, not for us, not to make this church better, but to make things better for outside of these walls and the ripples to go out into the world in ways that we cannot possibly imagine. And then last week we talked about how not just we as individuals, how we will never be alone, how you will never be alone if you don't want to be alone, because you're part of this community of faith. And just as you are part of this larger community of faith, so we as a community of faith are part of a larger denomination called the United Church of Christ. And so if we do not want to be alone, we have a choice. We can be alone as a congregation, or we can be tied to and know that we are not alone as a community of faith, as part of this United Church of Christ. And we talked about some of the characteristics, because we don't know a lot about this larger denomination. We don't talk about it all that much. But there are 4,700 churches in it. There's 740,000 members across the country. And if we're like, well, that seems like a little bit much to connect with everybody across the country, we talked about the Congregation of the Southern New England Conference, which is just Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and it has 115,000 members in it. 600 churches, and the executive conference minister, Reverend Darrell Goodwin, lives right here in Bloomfield. So that seems like far less of a reach for us to connect and do things together with people. And we said, if we do that, what we have the potential to do is a broader, not just as what we do very successfully here in Bloomfield, but connecting with that, what are some of the other things we can do together? But why is that important? What more things can happen when we get together as a larger community of faith? And that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today. And in the scripture today, it talks about, in Exodus, talks about first fruits. You shall observe the festival of harvest, of the first fruits of your labor of what you sow. Something we've talked about before, that Jesus talked about, how the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. It talks about when we go out there and we sow something good in the world, that things happen, that God does things that we can't possibly imagine, that gets that to go from sowing and planting the seeds to an enormous harvest that we then have to go out and do something about. That there's a part of it that God does that we have no capability of doing on our own. But we have a part in sowing and then going out and harvesting. But it talks about the first fruits. And the first fruits have a couple meanings in the Bible. One of them is that God asks us to give back some of what we get. And no, this is not a request for money. I'm just explaining the biblical text. But God asks for the first fruits of the harvest to come back to God. It's where the idea of tithing comes, and the 10% and all that kind of stuff, for asking to go back to God, or the way we look at it is back into the community of faith, or back into the community, however you want to give. If you want to give directly to a different group, give directly to a different group. If you don't want to give here, you don't have to give here, but give somewhere. Especially if matching funds, you work for a corporation that has matching funds and it can go double somewhere else instead of here, get it to go double somewhere else instead of here. But the idea is to take that and get that going in the community. But the other idea of first fruits is to go out and do the work and plant the seeds and work with God so there will be a harvest later. That we do the work, that we take the actions, the first steps of leadership for justice, love, and all those things, and see what happens as a result. So what we're going to do now is talk some about the firsts, or some of the big things, not all of the things that have happened, just a small sampling of things that have happened in the history of the Congregational Church of the United Church of Christ, when groups have worked together to make things happen. So one of the first things we're going to see here is this started really early. So the roots of the United Church of Christ and the Congregational Church go all the way back to the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came here, and the ideas of the original, of some of the original pastors of whom we have the original records, consistently talk about being open-minded and listening to other ideas in different ways of doing things. And some of the churches that were planted on the east coast of the United States were planted in the early 1600s. So then, early on, well before the modern, or not even the modern, but the full abolitionist movement came about, the Congregational churches had begun to work very hard to begin an abolitionist movement, to go against slavery. Now, we are not entirely pure or consistent on this. Right? A lot of Congregational churches were not people who opposed slavery early on. The first pastor, the pastor who was the first pastor of what was then Wintonbury Congregational Church, then Bloomfield Congregational Church, owned slaves. Right? That is a history that we need to look at. It's a history we need to understand, but it's not the complete history of this place. So then, you may or may not know this, but one of the parts of history in American history for the United Church of Christ is Old South Church in Boston. Anybody remember the poem of Paul Revere? Right? One if by land, two if by sea. That's Old South Church. Like, that church still exists. It still has an active congregation. And that is also the place, because you may recall that Congregational churches were also called meeting houses. Many people call this place here a meeting house. I happen to call it a sanctuary, but either one is totally fine, because it wasn't just for religious practice. It was for civic engagements, for all kinds of things going on in the community. And people were gathering to figure out what to do about some of this injustice and all that kind of stuff. And the Boston Tea Party started in the Old South Church, and then it got so big that the number of people, it couldn't fill the church. They spilled out into the streets, and all that was planned in the Congregational Church, as a matter of fact. So, even though we have this inconsistent history on racism and that kind of stuff, the first African-American pastor ordained in the entire country, I know it says Protestant here, but later research was done, and it's in the entire country across all denominations. The first black pastor ordained in the United States was in the United Church of Christ. It was in a Congregational church. As a matter of fact, this person was born in West Hartford and did a lot of their training in this church, in Wintonbury Congregational Church. Not in this particular building. We had a couple buildings before this one, but trained under the pastor who was here, and then did a lot of training and was ultimately ordained in Torrington, Connecticut. He was a hero of the Revolutionary War, was an author, and did all kinds of other remarkable things, but a deep history right here in this particular Congregational church. In addition to just social justice and other types of things, in terms of establishing schools or doing things for people who were otherwise shunned in the community and people didn't know what to do with them, and they were often just like hidden away in different places, they created the School for the Deaf. It was a Congregational church supported initiative, and it was the asylum for the School for the Deaf, which is actually how we get the street, Asylum Street, name for those of you who are familiar with Asylum Street here in the area. That's actually how it was named, because this school was the Asylum for the School for the Deaf, and that's how we end up getting the name of that street. So then some of you may be familiar with the history of the Amistad. For those of you who are interested in more about this, it is a remarkable story. It is a tremendous story. A replica of the Amistad was constructed here in Connecticut, and that boat is a seaworthy boat and goes all over the country, all over the world, teaching about social justice, teaching about the history of the Amistad, and so much more to help open our eyes and people's eyes about both history and what we continue to do in history. But the basic story of the Amistad, and those of you who know it well are going to say, well, you missed this, and you missed this, and you missed this. This is just a quick story of the Amistad. The slaves overran the boat, overran the ship, and took it over. And it docked just outside of the shoreline of kind of Connecticut, New York, right down in that area. And there's a great dispute about, since it was there, were the people property or were they not property? Right? And some of these people were jailed. Some of these people went to the homes of Congregational church members. And there was a big debate that went up to the Supreme Court about whether these people were property, because the people who, quote, owned them were suing for their property back. And ultimately, the Congregational church funded and the Congregational church supported an initiative that led to them not being declared property and ending up in their release. And then they had the choice of whether to stay here or to return. Now, that story is not pure either, and that is just an incredibly small summary of it, but that's the gist of what's going on and part of our history in that. And a lot of churches along the shoreline that still exist in Connecticut were actively involved in that initiative. So there were some early kind of anti-slavery campaigns and things, but even those weren't integrated. So the first fully integrated movement and institution that was combating slavery, the first fully integrated one, was led by the Congregational church and the Congregational churches in the area. The first woman pastor ordained in the country was in the United Church of Christ. Back then, the United Church of Christ didn't actually fully exist until 1957, so this was also in a Congregational church, didn't even have the right to vote yet. Right? We still, just to think about this in terms of timing, 1853, I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened before then, because it was happening like in the year 0, right, or year 33. Some of the very first preachers and leaders of churches were women. It's just history that the church early on tried to just suppress and suppress and suppress and suppress. But 1853 in the United States, first woman ordained pastor. This is still something being argued actively today. Right? Still being argued actively today. The Catholic Church doesn't allow anybody who's a woman to become ordained in the church. The Baptist Church was just arguing about this and starting to split apart about women not having the right to, like, they're taking away leadership roles for women. Like, this is something that is still active in 2023 in terms of debate and discussion. So it wasn't until 1957, and a bunch of stuff did happen in that intervening 100 years, but we're trying to not have this go 2.5 hours about the deep history of the United Church of Christ. But in 1957, that's when the United Church of Christ was formally established. And one of the reasons why that is relevant is that, as we spoke about last week, unlike other churches where denominations are created because they can't get along and they split and they split and they split, and then there's a new denomination because they split, this is the first church, Christian church, that was created by bringing multiple denominations together, who had differences and put some of those differences aside and came together as a uniting and united church. That's where that term comes and the name comes, United Church of Christ, from bringing those different denominations together with different cultural and racial and other backgrounds for that aspiration to continue to be on the front side of justice. And some of the immediate impacts of this, in 1959, there was an effort in some of the states in the South to not give media coverage, radio or television coverage at all, to the to all kinds of social justice movements, particularly related to the civil rights movement. And Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King came to the United Church of Christ and asked for an active intervention. They raised money, filed lawsuits, and then finally in federal court were able to make sure that things like this could not happen on the airwaves at that time. 1972, the ordination of the first openly gay minister in the United Church of Christ. First time that had happened in America, and if you think it's going to take a while for some of these other churches to allow women in leadership positions, we're going to be talking for another 100 years about this one in a lot of churches. This is still a frontline social justice issue, as are women's rights. Right? Still frontline social justice issues. So in 1973, some of you may be familiar with this, the Wilmington 10, charged with arson of a white-owned business. A number of people were put in jail, one of them a UCC activist and community organizer. The UCC raised $1 million to get bail for the people who they felt were unjustly and unfairly imprisoned. This is the kind of thing a single congregation would be incapable of doing on their own. So then 2005, voted for marriage equality and told the pastors within the communities of faith of the UCC that it was okay for them to go ahead and do marriages. Now, this has been going on for a while in a lot of United Church of Christ congregations well before this vote, but the national body brought this vote to bear for marriage equality, which is obviously still very much a frontline issue in the United States today. These things are just a small summary of the kind of things that the United Church of Christ has done over time, a series of firsts, a series of things, and there have been firsts and there have been failures, and there are things that people have sown that then have not taken place, or have sown and didn't make the national media attention. But this is the kind of thing that matters. When you say, oh, the United Church of Christ didn't support an initiative that was already well underway. The kind of thing of first to do this, first to do that, first to do this, get out there, take the blows, get out there, make the investments, engage in politics, engage in the community, engage in the national airways, engage in the courts, engage in the streets. This is our history. And it is imperfect. And it is flawed and deeply flawed in many ways, and these are things that we also need to understand about our history as well. But it is one of trying to make the world better, consistently acknowledging the places where the things have gone wrong, apologizing for those things, and then trying to make right and lead and push things forward from a social justice perspective in the United States time and time and time and time again. There are still so many different places that these firsts still need to take place. We can pick where some of those are. We are doing some firsts here in Bloomfield Congregational Church. We are leading on some of these firsts in the town of Bloomfield. We're very active in working with folks, and I'm not going to go down a new list about what those are, but at some point maybe we should talk about that. But there are a number of firsts that have happened just in the last several years with this congregation, this community of faith, which are just remarkable. But what are some of the ways that we can continue leading and continue joining with the Southern New England Conference or the National United Church of Christ to continue being a part of this tradition of first and leading us forward in social justice? What are some of those things? Well, I had the blessing, as many of you know, to go to the National Synod, which is the national gathering every several years where we get together and talk about what are some of those places that we're going to continue to push. What are those fronts that we're going to say as a congregation, as a denomination, that we are going to continue doing these first and going out for purposes of social justice? I had the opportunity to represent this congregation, the Southern New England Conference, and in other areas in the votes for these things. And the next time that I'm here when we get together, Reverend David Runis will be taking the service for next Sunday, and then the 27th I'll be back. And we will cover some of what those resolutions are that we have the opportunity to choose to get behind or not and decide. We won't decide on that on the 27th, but get together and look at what those things are. That we can choose to say, yes, we want to get behind this initiative and make a difference and get with these other 740,000 people, these other 4,700 churches, and maybe see how much we can get momentum so that we can get another one of these firsts on a new slide in 2023 or beyond. Amen.